Okay, good evening, everyone. Welcome to week number 2 for public budgeting and finance. It looks like we have about half of us are here so far, so we will go ahead and get started. It is 6 o'clock and then let others join us along the way. So hope everyone had a good Memorial Day weekend and that your week is off to a good start, even though we're almost halfway through the week already. Um, Thank you for your introductory posts. I've gone through and read all of those, and it's always good to see all the different jobs and all the different backgrounds and experiences that everyone has, and helps us kind of get to know each other a little bit better. And admittedly, with a 6-week virtual course, it's difficult for us to really get to know each other that well in that regard, but it's good to read your introduction. So thank you to everyone who posted their introduction. Then your first graded Canvas essay and responses to 2 classmates will be coming up due on June 5th. And I know a couple of people have already done it, and so thank you for those who got an early start on it. But for that one, what you're doing is I provided a link for you that will take you to the governor's budget for this upcoming fiscal year, along with a link to the May revise that was just published not long ago, a couple of weeks ago. And so what I'm asking you to do is to using that link to read through the summary of the governor's budget and then highlight a couple of priorities that you see in the governor's budget, and then read through the May revise, at least a summary of the May revise, and see if and how those 2 priorities have changed as a result of the May revise. We're going to talk more tonight about the budget process, and we'll look at the California budget process. I've also provided you with a couple of links on our Canvas site under this week's module to give you a few more specifics about the way in which the California budget process works. But as we had mentioned previously, one of the major dates in the California budget process is that May revise. And when that May revise comes out, we revise all of our revenue estimates. We're then going to have to make changes to the governor's proposed budget. And in previous years, the May revise has been very positive, and so the changes we made have been positive changes in that the governor has gone back in and has enhanced spending in a lot of our programmatic areas. This year, though, with the withdrawal of a lot of that federal COVID aid, with that money being gone, we're really starting to see the true impacts of COVID on the California economy, especially the service sector, and that's resulted in fewer revenues coming in. Also, we had this extension that was provided to California taxpayers so that Californians don't have to pay income taxes owed until October 15th. So that has delayed a lot of the tax collections that we normally would expect on April 15th. And I think the combination of all those things led to a decrease in the amount of revenue that we were actually generating as compared to our revenue forecast, which then obviously results in a budget deficit. And so what we need to then do is go back and revise the governor's budget downward, remove some spending, change some priorities. And so there are some negative consequences, obviously, of this year's May revise. So you're going to be highlighting 2 of the main priorities in the governor's original budget, and then how those priorities may have changed as a result of the May revise. So that's your Canvas essay coming due on June 5th. And then remember, you have to then respond to 2 of your classmates. Your Canvas essay doesn't have to be terribly long, and so it could be 2 or 3 paragraphs, so it doesn't have to be too extensive. Then your response to classmates, paragraph, couple sentences, certainly would do the job in those responses to your classmates. So that's what we have coming due, and again, that's for June 5th. Tonight, what I have planned is in the first half of class to talk about budget processes, introduce you to the 4 main phases in the budget process: planning, formulation, implementation, and evaluation, and then talk about how those processes manifest themselves at the federal level, and then how they manifest themselves in the state level, and to draw some similarities and some differences between how it's done at the federal level compared to how we do it here in the state of California. But one of the, the pre-essay, so the pre-instructional assignment is due on June 12th. So you've got a little bit of time, an extra week on that one. So June 12th for the pre-instructional. And so the interesting thing about some of the topics we're going to talk about tonight in terms of budget processes is that things are changing in real time. And you're probably aware that we had this debt ceiling crisis that we were dealing with, where we were going to run out of money on June the 5th if we had not suspended or increased the debt ceiling. The president and the Speaker of the House, primarily the president of the Senate, wasn't as involved. It was really a discussion between the Speaker of the House and the president. They came to a conclusion on a proposed piece of legislation to suspend the debt ceiling, to then allow us to continue to pay our bills. And that now is in the House Rules Committee as of today. And as of about 45 minutes ago, the Rules Committee was in recess. They had about a 4-hour session today where they were hearing testimony and hearing amendments that were being proposed by members of Congress, members of the House. They're going to reconvene, and then they're scheduled to hold a vote this evening on the piece of legislation. If it passes the Rules Committee tonight, then it would go to the floor of the House for a vote tomorrow. And the vote right now, according to the House schedule, is scheduled for 5:30 our time, 8:30 p.m. Eastern time on the House floor. But since this has some direct import for the topics we're talking about here tonight, the first half of class, let me just share with you a little bit more information about this piece of legislation and the process it's going to go through and some of the components in this piece of legislation, because again, it will have some pretty profound impacts upon some of the topics that we talk about in the first half of class tonight. So kind of like a moving target here. So again, this is current as of about 45 minutes ago, but the sands are shifting, and so things can change. And probably by the time we're done with this class tonight, things will already have changed. But here are the major points in this debt ceiling agreement that was reached by Speaker McCarthy and President Biden. And the whole idea here is we have a debt ceiling that every 1 to 2 years, we end up increasing the debt ceiling so we can continue to pay our bills. We issue debt, and then in order to issue that debt, you then have to promise to repay that debt. And so for the debt ceiling, essentially what we're talking about here is we're talking about the ability to pay off the debt that we have already accumulated, the debt we have already issued. And so every 1 to 2 years, we have these discussions about should we increase the debt ceiling? And every time we always increase the debt ceiling. The discussions this time became very contentious. The Democrats wanted to just have a clean debt ceiling increase. The Republicans in the House especially wanted to couple that increase in the debt ceiling with some substantive changes and reductions in our spending patterns. And so the agreement that Biden and McCarthy came to, the primary points of which are that the debt ceiling agreement will limit non-defense spending growth to 1% in fiscal year 2024. And basically what this means is we're going to more or less hold steady all of our non-defense spending for the next fiscal year. It will suspend the debt ceiling until January 1st, 2025. The current debt ceiling is $31.4 trillion, and that's trillion with a T. That means that we cannot incur debt above that level of $31.4 trillion. This legislation suspends the debt ceiling, so it doesn't increase it like we've done in the past. It suspends it through January 1st, 2025, meaning that Congress can continue to borrow money and pay the bills without regard to any type of a debt ceiling because it's been suspended. Now, it's important to note it's been suspended or will be suspended through January 1st, 2025, because that then conveniently takes us through the presidential election in 2024, in November of 2024. So neither party has to deal with this issue in the middle of a presidential election. So that's a primary reason why it was pushed to January of 2025. It also takes some of those unspent COVID relief funds and pulls those back in and kind of rescinds them, so that brings them back in from agencies. So if agencies haven't spent their COVID funds yet, that's going to recapture those COVID funds to then go toward either reducing the deficit or go toward other areas of spending. Resuming the student loan payments, and so student loan payments will resume as of August the 30th. It changes work requirements by raising the age from 49 to 54 for people, able-bodied Americans, to have to demonstrate that they have gainful employment in order to continue to receive benefits from SNAP and temporary assistance to needy family grants. Now, that means that up until this point in time, if you're an able-bodied person up to the age of 49, then you had to show gainful employment to continue to receive that type of welfare assistance. Now we're increasing the age to 54. So everyone up to the age of 54 must show that they are gainfully employed to receive those types of assistance. Above 54, you don't have that work requirement, so you don't have to worry about that if you're 55 or older. You don't have to worry about the work requirement if you're a veteran, if you're homeless, or if you're just leaving foster care as an 18-year-old. So it changes and kind of tightens up some of those work requirements. What really has a big impact for what we are going to talk about tonight is there is a piece of this legislation that will incentivize the passage of appropriation bills. The problem, as we'll talk about tonight at the federal level, is we rarely get all of our 12 appropriation bills passed by the end of the fiscal year on September 30th in preparation for the new fiscal year on October 1st. It's common for us to maybe pass 4 or 5 or 6 of those. We very rarely pass all 12 appropriation bills. So the goal here is that if all 12 appropriation bills for the next fiscal year are not passed by January 1st of 2024, Congress will then have an immediate continuing resolution, which will fund the government and avoid a government shutdown. But in that continuing resolution, all those areas of spending where the appropriation bills have not yet been passed, they will all experience a 1% decrease in all defense and non-defense spending. So this is meant to be such a politically repugnant type of punitive measure that it will force Congress to get its act together and to pass all the appropriation bills no later than December 31st of 2023. This is important for us because, as we'll talk about tonight, since we very rarely get all 12 appropriation bills passed by the beginning of the new fiscal year at the federal level on October 1st, we typically have a series of continuing resolutions that are temporary resolutions that end up expiring. And then what we do is we either then have a government shutdown, which we've had several times over the past decade, or we will put all of those unpassed appropriation bills together into what's called an Omnibus Budget Reconciliation Act, and then pass that Omnibus Budget Reconciliation Act as our budget. And that's because we can't do the process the way in which it's supposed to be done. So this basically incentivizes members of Congress to do the process the way it's supposed to be done by passing those 12 individual appropriation bills. Another important part of this piece of legislation that has import for what we're going to talk about tonight is this idea known as PAYGO. PAYGO is an acronym that really stands for Pay As You Go. PAYGO requires that if you are going to increase spending on one program, you must pay for that increase in spending through either a tax increase or by cutting spending in another program area. You have to pay for all of your spending increases as you go. PAYGO is something that was created back in 1990 in the Budget Enforcement Act, which we'll talk about a little bit later on. And now what Congress is doing is they want to expand PAYGO to include actions by the president as well. So the president decides that President Biden wants to spend more money on a certain type of program and proposes spending more on a program. He will have to show Congress that he's going to pay for it by cutting spending on another program. So it extends PAYGO requirements to include the president as well. Now, that could be a major shift in the way in which we do budgeting, except for the escape clause. And the president and Speaker McCarthy put in an escape clause for the president in that this pay-go requirement, this pay-as-you-go requirement, can actually be waived by the director of the Office of Management and Budget. And we'll talk a lot tonight about the Office of Management and Budget and what it does in preparing the president's budget. But if the director of the Office of Management and Budget says that, well, this money needs to be spent in order to carry out these programs, then the director can issue a waiver, and that will then waive this pay-as-you-go requirement. That issuance of a waiver by the director of the Office of Management and Budget is then not subject to judicial review. So Congress cannot then say, well, we disagree with that. We're going to challenge that in the courts. There is no judicial review for that decision of a waiver made by the director of the Office of Management and Budget. Now, I was watching today some of the hearings for the Rules Committee, and there were several Republican members who appeared before the Rules Committee offering up amendments to this piece of legislation to get rid of that waiver ability by the director of the OMB. So this is a kind of a contentious partisan battle in terms of whether or not OMB can simply just waive this requirement or not. Currently, in the piece of legislation, as it's currently written, the director of OMB can waive it, and there's no challenge to that waiver by the director of the OMB. Another provision in this piece of legislation is to remove $1.4 billion of the planned spending for next year for the IRS. That's a portion that was going to go toward enforcement for the IRS, to hire more agents to go out there and to enforce tax laws. That money has been pulled back with this piece of legislation. The piece of legislation also then makes it easier for permitting for energy projects, including energy projects that include oil and gas. So it's not just easier energy permitting for renewable energy, but also for the oil and the gas industry. And so when you look through these different, and there are other things, but these are what I consider to be the main provisions in the debt ceiling agreement. When you look at these major provisions, you see there are some victories there for Republicans and there are some victories there for Democrats. And that's why conservative Republicans are not happy with this piece of legislation. Progressive liberal Democrats are also not happy. And so you've got your extreme ends of both parties that are unhappy with this piece of legislation. And for it to actually make its way through Congress and be signed by the president by next Monday, June 5th, when we technically run out of money, you're really going to have to rely upon the centrists. You're going to have to rely upon the rank and file Republicans and rank and file Democrats, because you're probably going to lose those members at the extreme ideological ends of both political parties. Well, how's this process going to work in getting this through the House of Representatives? And this is a challenge right now for Speaker McCarthy, because he needs to hold his troops together and try and get this through the House. Today, it's being considered by the Rules Committee. And as I said, they had about a 4.5 hour hearing that they held. They then went in recess. They're going to be coming back in session if they're not back in session already. And tonight, they'll then be hearing from other members and then putting the finishing touches on the rules that will govern how this piece of legislation will then be considered on the floor. The way in which the House of Representatives works is before a piece of legislation goes to the floor, it must first go through the Rules Committee. The Rules Committee will then determine what legislation is allowed to go to the floor for debate and for passage. The Rules Committee will also determine how the debate will occur with that piece of legislation. Some legislation, the Rules Committee will pass what they call a closed rule. And if they pass a closed rule, that means that there's no debate, there are no amendments that are allowed in the piece of legislation. It goes to the floor and it gets an up or down vote. Now, the way in which the House usually works is that the people who oppose the legislation will probably move to remand the piece of legislation back to committee. And then once that gets voted down, then you move to the actual vote on the piece of legislation. There can also be a more modified open rule that the Rules Committee passes. And if they pass a more modified open rule, that would then allow a certain number and types of amendments that can be offered on the floor and will then allow for debate. And will take the amount of time given for debate, allocate part of that to the Republicans and part of that to the Democrats. And that's what you then see on C-SPAN. When you have a Republican member get up and say, I yield 2 minutes to the gentle lady from the state of Texas. And then that representative gets up and talks for a while for their 2 minutes. And then the Democratic leader will then yield some time to a Democrat to then get up and talk. So we're not clear right now as to whether or not there'll be a closed or an open rule passed by the Rules Committee. Where as of 45 minutes ago, we weren't 100% sure that the Rules Committee would allow it to go to the floor. Because then you've got some opposition, and a lot of the opposition is coming from the Freedom Caucus in the Republican Party. The Rules Committee is comprised of 13 members. 9 are Republicans and 4 are Democrats. And typically in the Rules Committee, you have what's called a 2-to-1 rule, where the majority party will have at least a 2-to-1 majority over the minority party in terms of the number of seats on the Rules Committee. That's why there are 9 Republicans and there are 4 Democrats. Of those 9 Republicans, right there, and when I put the slides together, there were 6 of those 9 who were definite yes votes, and there were 3 that were potential no votes. That 6 number has now gone up to 7. And that Representative Massey has now come out and said that he will vote for this piece of legislation to go to the floor of the House tomorrow. So right now you only have 2 Republicans on the committee, Roy and Norman, who are 100% voting no on this piece of legislation. So since you have 7 Republicans who are saying they're voting for it, that is a majority of the 13 members. And even if the 4 Democrats vote no, those 7 Republicans will be enough to then move it onto the floor of the House tomorrow. The big question now is, how will it get to the floor of the House? Will it be under a closed rule? Will it be under a modified open rule? You know, how many amendments are allowed and what type of debate is going to be allowed as well? During the hearing, the Rules Committee hearing today, there are several members of Congress who appeared before the committee to offer up amendments and defend their amendments and ask, this is an amendment that I'd like to make to the piece of legislation. I would like this amendment considered on the floor tomorrow. So the Rules Committee will determine which, if any, of those proposed amendments will be subject to debate on the floor of the House on Wednesday. But assuming that the Rules Committee does pass this piece of legislation through, then it will go to the floor of the House tomorrow. Again, the vote is scheduled for 8:30 p.m. Eastern time. You only need a majority vote in order to pass it on the floor of the House. It's very likely that there will be a majority to vote for. I would assume you'll probably have about 2/3 of Republicans who will vote for it. You'll probably have at least 80 to 100 Democrats who will vote for it, which will put you well above the majority you need to pass it on the floor of the House. Once it passes on the floor of the House, it then has to go to the Senate. And the reason why it always has to start in the House is the Constitution says that all revenue generating pieces of legislation must first start in the House of Representatives. And so that's why this is starting in the House. It'll then go to the Senate. In the Senate, you need to have at least 60 votes in order to pass in the Senate because of the filibuster. And so it's a higher bar to pass in the Senate, but there's also less opposition to it in the Senate as well. So I'd assume it'll be passed in pretty short order in the Senate. It's possible the Senate could pass it by a voice vote. And if individual members of the Senate don't stand up and stop it, it'll be passed as a voice vote, and there won't even actually be a recorded vote on it. It'll pass the Senate, then it'll go to President Biden's desk. President Biden will then sign it. And all this should happen before Monday, June 5th, when we would then, in theory, without this, end up exceeding the debt ceiling. So that's how the process is going to be working over the next couple of days. So I do recommend you keep an eye on it. Again, the Rules Committee is doing its work tonight. Then by tomorrow, if everything goes the way it's supposed to go, it'll then be voted on by the House of Representatives and then passed by the Senate probably on Thursday and make it to the president's desk probably by Friday. I just wanted to mention that because, again, it has direct impact upon our discussion tonight of the federal budgeting process. And hopefully a lot of these things will make a little bit more sense as we go through our discussion of the federal budgeting process itself. So just wanted to share that with you so you're up to date on what's going on today in the world of budgeting. Let me go ahead and share out our budget process slides. Wait for those to get up there. And I go and get my chat open. Okay. So what I'd like to do tonight in the first half of class is to talk about, we'll start with the federal budgeting process, then we'll move into a discussion of the state budgeting process, and then a little bit on local budgeting processes as well. But we always start with the federal budget process because state and local processes really piggyback on how the national government does it. And so our approaches at the state and the local level look very similar in many respects to what goes on at the federal level. So in your typical budget cycle, there are 4 different phases to a typical budget cycle. There's preparation, formulation, implementation, and audit and evaluation. So the way in which it works is that we start with preparation. Preparation is where we put together our revenue forecasts, our expenditure estimates, where we figure out how much money we have to spend in the next fiscal year. This is going to happen obviously well before the fiscal year begins, and typically it's going to happen for about a year before the president's budget is put together. Then we move into the second phase, which is formulation. Formulation occurs whenever the president delivers their budget to Congress. So once Congress starts to get its claws into the budget, usually in early February, that's where we start the formulation phase. The formulation phase will then run until the end of the federal fiscal year, which is September 30th. And by September 30th, we should then have a budget that's been passed by Congress and is then ready to go to the president for the president's signature. Implementation then begins with the first day of the federal fiscal year, which is October 1st. Implementation will then run from October 1st until the following September 30th. Then audit and evaluation is once that fiscal year ends, we then have to go back and audit the books. We have to go back and make sure that we spent the money in the way in which we said we were going to spend the money in these appropriation bills. So preparation, formulation, implementation, audit, evaluation are your 4 different phases of your typical budget cycle. So let's look at the federal budget process, each one of those 4 phases and what actually goes on in each one of those 4 phases. So let's start with preparation. In preparation, again, this is where we're putting together our revenue forecasts. We're coming up with how much money we actually have to spend in the next fiscal year. The 2 main players in preparation at the federal level are the Office of Management and Budget, the OMB, and the Congressional Budget Office. The OMB, the Office of Management and Budget, serves the president. It is an executive level agency. It is located within the executive office of the president. Congressional Budget Office, like its name says, is a legislative organization. It is created by Congress and it serves the budget needs of Congress. So we have one executive organization and one legislative organization. They will produce their own reports, if you will, of revenue forecasts and expenditure estimates. OMB produces what it calls its current services estimates. In the current service estimate, OMB will ask the basic question: how much will it cost us next fiscal year to provide the same level of services that we provided in this fiscal year? Because as we know, the value of money changes. There are inflationary concerns, and we're all painfully aware of inflation. Inflationary concerns means that doing the same thing next year will probably cost you more than it costs you to do it this year. That's what those current service estimates will do. And that's primarily what we end up getting from OMB. CBO's approach is what's called baseline budget projections. And the big difference between what OMB does and what CBO does is that they use different methodologies to arrive at their expenditure estimates and their revenue forecast. Give you an example. OMB and CBO use different what we call discount rates in doing their calculation for the value of money over time. So if you use a different discount rate, OMB uses a different discount rate than CBO uses, OMB is going to come up to a different result and come up with a different result than CBO will. So it's not unusual to see OMB's revenue forecast and expenditure estimates look different than CBO's because they are using different types of methodologies. Since their forecasts and their estimates are different, the question then becomes which agencies' forecasts and estimates are more accurate and less biased. Accuracy and bias are two related terms, but they are not the same thing. Accuracy doesn't have a plus or minus sign. So for accuracy, you would say, here's the revenue that was forecasted in the fiscal year by OMB. Here's the amount of revenue we actually generated. The difference there is your measure of accuracy, but there's no plus or minus directionality to it. Bias has directionality, a plus or minus. So when you ask bias, we're asking, does this organization tend to underestimate or overestimate? Is there a pattern to their inaccuracies? What we have found is that OMB and CBO, even though they're using different methodologies, they both tend to be relatively accurate when you compare their forecasts to the actual amount of revenue that we have generated. The difference, though, is in terms of bias. OMB, when it is inaccurate, its inaccuracies tend to overestimate, over forecast revenues. CBO tends to under forecast revenues. So CBO is much more conservative in their forecasts than what we tend to see with OMB. OMB is sometimes said to suffer from this phenomenon known as rosy scenario, where they will make the budget picture look too good. And one of the reasons why they do that is because they are serving the president, and it serves the president's policy purposes to make the economic situation look rosier and better than it actually is. But OMB and CBO will put together a series of these forecasts and these expenditure estimates. Once they put those together, then OMB is in charge of putting together the president's executive budget. So OMB will then put out a call for budget requests to all the agencies and departments across the federal government. It's what used to be known as Circular A-22. And they would put out these budget requests and they would tell agencies and departments, tell us how much money you anticipate needing in this next fiscal year. That's where these agencies and departments will engage in some budget maximization and strategic misrepresentation, like we talked about last week. They will overestimate the amount of money that they need. OMB will then take those estimates, they will then cut them back, make reductions to them, and then those revised budget requests will then be cobbled together into the president's executive level budget. So OMB really is very much the right arm of the president in terms of putting the budget together on an annual basis. Once OMB has assembled the president's budget, typically late in January, the president will then go and give a State of the Union address to Congress. The State of the Union address is required in the Constitution. The Constitution requires that the president will update Congress on the State of the Union. It doesn't say, when they have to do it, but it's become an annual type of event, usually at the end of January, the very beginning of February. After the State of the Union address, the president will then deliver their budget to Congress, usually about the second or third week of February. When the president's budget goes to Congress, we then shift from the preparation phase into the formulation phase. So when we're talking about formulation, we're talking about Congress and Congress's consideration of the president's budget. When the president's budget goes to Congress, the central starting point for the president's budget will be the House Budget Committee and the Senate Budget Committee. So the House and the Senate each have one budget committee. The House Budget Committee and the Senate Budget Committee then have the responsibility for passing a budget resolution. Today, that budget resolution is referred to, and I'll put it in text chat, a concurrent resolution on the budget. That concurrent resolution on the budget needs to be passed by the House and the Senate budget committees no later than April 15th. Now, it's a resolution, so it does not require presidential signature. It's a resolution concurrent because it is a resolution that is being passed by both the House as well as the Senate. The idea behind this concurrent resolution on the budget is that the concurrent resolution on the budget will set maximum spending amounts in all of your different programmatic areas. So it will say, here's the maximum amount of money that we can spend on education programs. Here's the maximum amount of money that we can spend on health and human services. Here's the amount of money we can spend on veterans affairs. Here's the amount of money we can spend on defense, and so on and so on. So it'll establish those maximum spending caps in each of our programmatic areas. The goal, obviously, is to impose some fiscal discipline on Congress. So Congress doesn't go out there and overspend and spend money that it does not have, even though it still does. So by April 15th, this concurrent resolution on the budget needs to be adopted by the House and the Senate. Then you end up with kind of a two-pronged approach in the formulation phase after that. On one side, you have what's called the appropriations process. On the other side, you have what's called the authorization process. So the appropriation process is for what we consider to be discretionary spending. And there are two different types of spending in the federal budget. There's discretionary spending and there's mandatory spending. Discretionary spending is spending that Congress has direct control over. So if Congress says, we want to spend less money on program X, they can spend less money on program X. They can directly alter the amount of money they're spending on that program. That's within the discretion of Congress. That's considered to be discretionary spending. Programs that fall within this discretionary spending category go through the appropriations process, in that there is one appropriations committee in the House and there is one appropriations committee in the Senate. The House Appropriations Committee and the Senate Appropriations Committee will each have 12 different subcommittees, 12 different appropriations subcommittees. Each one of those 12 appropriation subcommittees will work on their own appropriation bill for their jurisdiction of spending. So there'll be an a House Education Appropriations Subcommittee. They'll work on the appropriations bill for education. They will then hold hearings. They will invite in speakers to testify. They will mark up and amend this appropriation bill for education. They will then vote on the education appropriation bill. And if it passes the subcommittee, it then moves up to the House Appropriations Committee. And then the same type of things going on in the Senate. The parent House Appropriations Committee and Senate Appropriations Committee, they will then hold their own hearings on this education appropriation bill. They will call in people to testify. They will mark it up and make amendments to it, and then eventually vote on passing this education appropriation bill to the floor of the House. And then the same type of thing will happen over for the floor of the Senate. So the Appropriation Committee will be doing this 12 different times for these 12 appropriation bills that come out of those 12 different appropriation subcommittees. Once the appropriation bills are then passed by the House Appropriations Committee, the Senate Appropriations Committee, they then go to the floor of the House and the floor of the Senate for consideration. Typically, when they go to the floor, they typically go as privileged legislation, meaning that a closed rule will be passed in the House, whereby it will limit the amount of debate on this appropriation bill and will also limit the number and the types of amendments that can be offered to this appropriations bill. As a privileged piece of legislation, it's meant to try and move it through the House floor much quicker than a non-privileged piece of legislation. As we had said before, we were talking about the debt ceiling agreement in the House of Representatives. For a bill to get to the floor, it usually has to go through the Rules Committee. Now, there are some exceptions to that, and Congress has gotten very good at finding ways around the Rules Committee. One way to find your way around the Rules Committee is by simply suspending the rules. So if you can get a supermajority of the House to suspend the rules, then you can get a bill to force it directly onto the House floor without having to go through the Rules Committee. But you would have to suspend the rules in order to do that. So the Rules Committee in the House of Representatives is a very powerful committee. It's the gatekeeper for the bills that get to the floor of the House. In the Senate, it's a different situation in that the Rules Committee is completely different. The Rules Committee in the Senate is not the same as the Rules Committee in the House. For a piece of legislation to get to the floor of the Senate, it gets there through what is called a UCA, which stands for a unanimous consent agreement. So in essence, for a piece of legislation to go to the floor of the Senate, all members need to agree to allow it to go to the floor of the Senate. That sounds a lot more difficult than it really is. It is relatively simple. It's become more difficult recently because of partisanship, but traditionally it's relatively simple in the Senate to get a UCA and get a bill onto the floor of the Senate because of this process known as log rolling. Log rolling occurs in Congress all the time. It's basically a quid pro quo that I'm not going to stop your bill from going to the floor for fear that you will stop my bill. So if I let your bill go, you're going to let my bill go. And that usually allows you to get these UCAs. Now, in recent years, we've seen some members of the Senate who have stood up and stopped legislation from going to the Senate floor. And they can't stop it forever, but they certainly can slow it down. And that's a phenomenon that's become much more common in recent years than we've ever seen used before. The Senate is a much more egalitarian, much more collegial type of body, where every member of the Senate is viewed as having an equal amount of power. In the House, every member of the House is not equal. New members of the House are referred to as backbenchers. They typically don't have plum committee assignments. They typically don't have a whole lot of time to speak on the floor of the House. When they do speak, they're usually speaking in front of an empty chamber. It's a much more power-driven type of situation in the House, much more egalitarian situation over in the Senate. But that's the idea of what's called appropriations, the appropriations process. And the ultimate goal is that you will have 12 appropriation bills passed by the House and the Senate before the end of the fiscal year on September 30th, that the president can then sign by the beginning of the new fiscal year on October 1st. That's for discretionary spending. So that's one process. Then you also have a second type of spending known as mandatory spending. Mandatory spending is spending that Congress does not have direct control over. So things such as interest on the national debt. Congress has issued $31.4 trillion in debt. That $31.4 trillion in debt must be paid off eventually. You must make principal and interest payments on it. It's a legal obligation that you have agreed to. Congress cannot just say, we're going to stop paying off our debt. The 14th Amendment of the Constitution says that debt incurred by the United States that has been authorized by law, the validity thereof may not be questioned. And so you cannot question the validity of debt that's been issued by the national government. So you got to pay for the debt that you have issued. So therefore, it's mandatory in nature. Another example of mandatory spending would be something like an entitlement program. I'm sure you're very familiar with entitlement programs. Entitlement programs are eligibility-based programs whereby a family can get these benefits if they meet the eligibility requirements. And so if their household income level is below a certain legislative threshold, they can then be legally entitled to these benefits. Once someone is legally entitled to benefits, legally eligible for benefits, Congress cannot take that money away. This is a promise that has been made to those eligible families. So that entitlement program then becomes mandatory spending. If Congress wants to reduce the amount of spending on an entitlement program, they can't do it directly through appropriations. They must do it through authorizations. And authorization is kind of this other process that's running along at the same time as appropriations. So you kind of have two different tracks. The appropriations track for discretionary spending the authorization track for mandatory spending. If you want to say, for example, Social Security, you want to spend less money on Social Security. If you want to do that, you have to go through the authorizations process and you need to change the eligibility requirements. If you want to spend less on Social Security, you're probably going to have to increase the retirement age. And so you'll increase the retirement age up to 70 or 72, thus making fewer people eligible, thus meaning you're going to be spending less money on Social Security. So at the same time we're passing out these 12 appropriation bills in the appropriation side, we are then reauthorizing programs and eligibility requirements in the authorization side of the budgeting process. The problem that we run into, constitutionally, the Constitution says that before a piece of legislation can go to the president, it must pass the House and the Senate in identical versions. So when you have an appropriation bill that passes the House that looks different than the appropriation bill that passed the Senate, it's time for a conference committee. So you put together a conference committee made up of members of the House and members of the Senate, usually from the House Appropriations Committee and the Senate Appropriations Committee. They will meet in conference committee to hammer out the differences. So sometimes you'll see in the transcript, they'll say the Senate recedes on this point, which means the Senate adopts the House position. Or if the House recedes, it means the House is adopting the Senate's version. You hammer out these differences, come up with a uniform piece of legislation. The uniform legislation then goes back to the floor of the House and the Senate to be passed before it is then eligible to go to the desk of the president for signature. Then there's also what's known as reconciliation. Reconciliation is the process of bringing spending in line with those targets that were established in that concurrent resolution on the budget. You have to reconcile what your final appropriation bill looks like compared to the amount of money that you were authorized to spend under that concurrent resolution on the budget. Reconciliation is a process whereby, at least in the US Senate, you can sometimes get around the use of the filibuster. If you do something through reconciliation in the Senate, then you oftentimes can avoid that filibuster and you only need a simple majority as opposed to needing those 60 votes to break up a filibuster. In the Senate, we've thrown around the term filibuster a lot. You're probably familiar with a filibuster, but in the Senate, a filibuster is when a minority in the Senate can hold up legislation. And they can do it by literally just getting up on the Senate floor and reading from the DC area phone book or reading from magazine articles or whatever you want to do just to waste time to keep that piece of legislation from being considered by the Senate. That's called a filibuster. In order to stop a filibuster in the Senate, you need this thing known as a motion of cloture. And if you get this motion, this vote of cloture, it will then close down the filibuster and allow you to go ahead and vote on that piece of legislation. But to get a vote of cloture, you have to have the agreement of at least 60 members of the Senate. It used to be 67. Thanks to Senator Byrd, when he was around, he lowered that threshold down to 60. So now you only need 60 members to agree to close down filibuster and to then close down filibuster and then consider a piece of legislation. However, in a very evenly divided Senate like we currently have today, getting up to that 60 number can be very, very challenging. And that's why the filibuster has been modified under the Reid administration when Reid was the majority leader in the Senate. He removed the filibuster for appointments to the Supreme Court and for some other types of things, just because it really does slow down consideration of legislation. But you have to reconcile this legislation in order to make sure that you are in accordance with those targets that you establish in your concurrent budget resolution. As I said before, you also have to have those conference committees to then hammer out the differences between the version that comes out of the House and the version that comes out of the Senate. But if everything works the way in which it's supposed to work, by September 30th, the House and the Senate have passed 12 appropriation bills. Those 12 appropriation bills then go to the president. The president then signs those appropriation bills, And then the beginning of the new fiscal year on October 1st, we then have a new budget in place and the government continues to operate. That's how the process is supposed to work. It is not the way in which the process works. That's how it's supposed to work on paper. That's not how it actually works. Typically, all 12 appropriation bills are not passed by Congress and signed by the president in time for the new fiscal year on October 1st. That's when the implementation is supposed to begin. That's when we're supposed to start spending the money, is on October 1st. That rarely happens. When that doesn't happen, and we have some appropriation bills that have not yet been passed by Congress and signed by the president, then Congress will issue these things called continuing resolutions. A continuing resolution is a temporary resolution of Congress that will fund all those areas that have not yet had their appropriations approved, will fund them at a percentage of what they got last year. So what the continuing resolution may say is, we will fund the Department of Agriculture at 80% of what it received last year for this period of time, but this will expire after about usually 2 to 3 weeks. So after 2 weeks, the continuing resolution then expires. Once it expires, then the Department of Agriculture has now lost its authority to spend money again. So then Congress has to pass another continuing resolution for another 2 or 3 week period. Once that one expires, and they have to pass another continuing resolution, and so on, until Congress panics. When Congress panics, either the Congress panics and says, we're not going to do any more continuing resolutions, or the president says, I will not support any more continuing resolutions, then Congress and the president have two choices. Choice A is a government shutdown. So for all of those areas where the appropriation bills have not been passed, those operations will then shut down. The second choice is to cobble together all the unapproved appropriation bills, put them all together into this mammoth piece of legislation known as an Omnibus Budget Reconciliation Act, or an OBRA. Rather than following the process that's supposed to work, over the past couple of decades, Congress and the president have really chosen between path A and path B, shutting down the government or cobbling everything together into an Omnibus Budget Reconciliation Act. Obviously, shutting the government down is not a good thing. When you shut the government down for all those agencies that do not yet have authorized appropriations, it means that you're not serving citizens anymore. It means those federal employees are going to be told, non-essential federal employees are going to be told to stay home, don't come to work. Once the budget agreement is hashed out, they're then returning to work and they're going to get paid back pay for all the time that they spent sitting at home. So you're still going to end up spending the money anyway. It also doesn't help in terms of our credit rating, is that credit rating agencies get really, really nervous whenever there is a government shutdown and threaten to lower the credit rating of the federal government. So usually bad things happen with these partial government shutdowns. But bad things happen with Omnibus Budget Reconciliation Acts as well. When you're throwing all these unpassed appropriation bills together into this mammoth piece of legislation, a lot of other things get thrown in there. So in order to get a member to support this Omnibus Budget Reconciliation Act, you will agree to put their pet project in there. So they want to have this bridge that's named after them built. You'll put that in the OBRA in order to get that member to approve it. Another member may want a recreation center built with federal money that's named after them. And so you put that in there as well to get their support. So we tend to overspend whenever we have these Omnibus Budget Reconciliation Acts. They tend to be thousands upon thousands of pages long. We oftentimes don't know what is in the OBRA until weeks after that OBRA has been passed. So OBRAs lead to a lot of overspending, lead to a lot of what we call pork barrel spending, unnecessary spending in the federal budget. But recently, that's how we've done budgets, either through forcing a government shutdown or through Omnibus Budget Reconciliation Acts, or a combination of the two. They're not mutually exclusive. So we'll go into a government shutdown for several weeks until it's no longer tenable, and then we'll pass the budget to an Omnibus Budget Reconciliation Act. Now, under this debt ceiling agreement that we started out the class tonight talking about, this is going to change. That if the 12 appropriation bills are not passed by January 1st of 2024, there'll automatically be a continuing resolution to fund all those agencies that don't yet have their appropriations, and they'll be funded at 1% less than what they received in the last fiscal year. So this is going to become an automatic process for 2024. That then goes away in 2025, and then we'll be back to how we currently are in 2025. But the problem is that as the budgeting process has become more and more partisan, we've seen the two parties move to their ideological extremes, which hollows out that middle ground. It's that middle ground where we tend to be able to make agreements and negotiations for a budget. And one of the reasons why we've seen the parties shift to their ideological extremes is through the process of political gerrymandering. And you're probably familiar with gerrymandering. Gerrymandering is when parties will create congressional districts in the House of Representatives as well as in state legislatures that are what we call safe districts, whereby Republicans will create districts that will give them the highest possibility of having their Republican members reelected. Democrats will do the same for their Democratic incumbents. And not to get too much into the weeds on political gerrymandering, but there are a couple of different approaches we see used in gerrymandering. That's what's called packing and what's called cracking. Oops, packing and cracking. Packing is, assume you have a situation where you have, it's a majority Republican area, but you have a stronghold of Democratic voters. So what you will do is you'll draw a district just for those Democratic voters, and you'll pack all those Democratic voters into that one district, and then all the other districts you create will then be majority Republican. You give up one seat to then gain all these other seats for your party. You're packing all the opposition into one district. The other approach is cracking, where you'll take, say, a Republican stronghold, and the Democrats will then break that up into multiple districts so that each district will have a small minority Democrat, but then be majority Republican. So that you know, however you want to work it, so that you know that the majority party is going to win all those seats. So through cracking and through packing, you're able to gerrymander and create safe districts. Well, so what? What does a safe district have for this partisanship? When you create those safe districts, incumbents know that they're going to win the general election because there aren't enough voters from the other party to win. So they're going to win that general election. What they have to be concerned about is winning their primary. They have to be concerned about having people running against them from within their own party. Well, who tends to vote in primaries? Your more active ideological members of political parties. So as an incumbent, it's in your best interest to get reelected to appeal to those very ideological voters in your primary election, which means that you are going to cater to people who are more at the extreme ideological edge of your party, which means that Republicans will then act more conservative, Democrats will act more liberal, the parties move apart from each other, and it becomes sometimes next to impossible to get negotiations and agreement on a budget. And so those safe districts are really creating this partisanship, this ultra partisanship that has made it very difficult for us to get budgets done on time at the federal level. But if everything works well, which it never does, but if everything works well, all 12 appropriation bills are passed by the beginning of the new fiscal year on October 1st. The implementation phase begins with the beginning of that new fiscal year. So in implementation, this is where we execute the budget. This is where we are spending the money. We'll run from October 1st until September 30th at the federal level. Here in the state of California, our fiscal year runs from July 1st until June 30th. So at the state level, we operate on a different fiscal year than the federal government. Then when the fiscal year ends, so at the federal level, when it ends on September 30th, we then move into our fourth phase, which is audit and evaluation. So the fiscal year has ended, the money has been spent. We now have to go out back and look at how that money was spent. Agencies at the federal level will submit what they call their performance activity reports, their PAR report cards. In those performance activity reports, they will have to report on how this money that they have spent has helped them make progress toward achieving their goals. Under the Bush administration, agencies would receive, this is the second Bush administration, fiscal year 2003, agencies started receiving red, yellow, and green light indicators. An agency that was making substantial progress toward its goals got a green light indicator and was then eligible for larger appropriations in the next year, a 2% enhancement on their appropriations in the next fiscal year. Agencies that were making progress but not making substantial progress in the eyes of the Office of Management and Budget would then receive what is called a yellow light indicator, which means that they are then eligible but not guaranteed that budget enhancement in the next fiscal year. Agencies that did not make adequate progress would get a red light indicator. They were prohibited from receiving that 2% augmentation to their budget requests in the next fiscal year. So these performance activity reports as of fiscal year 2003 really had some teeth to them in that they were tied directly to future appropriations. The main agency at the federal level in audit and evaluation is this thing called the GAO, the Government Accountability Office. It used to be called the General Accounting Office. It's now called the Government Accountability Office. The Government Accountability Office in the audit phase will conduct examinations and audits of programs across the entire federal government to see how effectively these programs are operating. When you take this audit and evaluation phase and you add it to implementation, you add that to formulation, you add that to preparation, the entire federal budget cycle will last probably longer than 3 years. When you are in the preparation phase for two fiscal years from now, you're in the formulation phase for next fiscal year, you're in the implementation phase for the current fiscal year, and you're in the audit and evaluation phase for last fiscal year. So you have all these fiscal year budgets that are overlapping upon each other in different phases of the process. You're dealing with multiple fiscal year budgets all at the same time. The implication of that, obviously, is it makes the federal budgeting process very complex, very time-consuming, and sometimes very difficult to understand. People who have served in Congress for 30 and 40 years will still admit that they do not know all of the nuances and the nooks and crannies in federal budget processes. You could teach an entire graduate level program on the federal budget process. It is that lengthy, it is that convoluted, and it is that detailed. But essentially what happens is the federal budget process will flow through those 4 different cycles in a very similar way as to the way in which the state of California process works as well. We did realize very early on that we were failing on 2 fronts in the federal budget process. One problem that we had is we were not getting budgets done on time. The second problem we had is that we were having trouble balancing our budget. At the federal level, I think I may have mentioned this last week, since 1969, we have run federal budget deficits where our expenditures have exceeded our revenues for every single fiscal year from 1969 until today, with the exception of 2 fiscal years. There are only 2 fiscal years at the end of the Clinton administration, beginning of the Bush administration, 99 and 2000, where we actually had a surplus. Other than those 2 years, every year we run a budget deficit. So not only are we not getting budgets done on time, we're not bringing our budgets in balance, balancing our revenues and our expenditures. So for years, for decades, we have been trying to reform the budget process to get budgets done on time and to bring them into balance. And we're still not doing it. One of the earliest things that we did was the creation of this thing called the Bureau of the Budget. It became very clear in the early 1900s that the president needed some help in putting the budget together. Because even in the 19 teens and into the 1920s, the federal government was growing. And so we needed to have some organization in charge of the budget. And that led to the creation of what was called BOB, the Bureau of the Budget. In 1937, as a result of the Brownlow Commission, and I'm sure in your 500 class, you talked about Luther Gulick, you probably talked about the Brownlow Commission. The Brownlow Commission fundamentally reorganized the federal bureaucracy. And one of the reorganization attempts by the Brownlow Commission was to create this thing called the Executive Office of the President. The Executive Office of the President was essentially an umbrella in which we would place all these management agencies within this executive office. The Bureau of the Budget in 1937 was designated as a management agency, what we call an overhead agency, and was placed within the Executive Office of the President. Over the years, the Bureau of the Budget became a lot more than just a clearinghouse for the president's budget. The Bureau of the Budget really became the management arm of the president in managing the finances of the executive branch. So much so that in 1970, in the Nixon administration, the Bureau of the Budget was then renamed the Office of Management Budget, or the OMB. And that's the OMB that we are talking about tonight. That's the OMB that does these current service estimates. That's the OMB that will provide these waivers to PAYGO for the president under this debt ceiling agreement. Office of Management Budget is the single most important and influential agency at the federal level in the federal budgeting process. And that's where the Office of Management Budget came from. We get into the 1970s. In the 1970s, we are realizing that, again, we are not getting our budgets done on time, and we are also running deficits. By 1974, we had now run 5 consecutive years of deficits where expenditures had exceeded our revenues. So in 1974, Congress puts together this big mammoth piece of legislation to fundamentally reform the federal budgeting process known as the Budget and Impoundment Control Act. The Budget and Impoundment Control Act, we tried several things to get the federal budget process under control. Number one, we tried to make Congress a co-equal with the president in the budgeting process. The president had OMB. The president had their budgeting arm that they could use to manage the budgeting process. Congress didn't have that. And so we needed to create an organization, the Congressional Budget Office, to try and make Congress this co-equal in the budgeting process. We needed to centralize budget formulation, the second phase of the process within Congress. Before the Budget and Impoundment Control Act, when the president's budget arrived in Congress, it bounced all over the place and everyone got a little piece of the budget. We need to have a centralized starting point. And so that's when we create these House and Senate budget committees and said, this is where the president's budget will start in formulation. We wanted to eliminate deficits and we wanted to get our budgets done on time. So we had several distinct goals that we were trying to accomplish. The ways in which we tried to accomplish those goals, as I said, we created a House and Senate Budget Committee to be the centralized starting point for the president's budget. We created this thing known as a budget resolution, whereby we would say, here are the explicit amounts of money that can be spent in each of these programmatic areas. Under the Budget and Impoundment Control Act, it created 2 different budget resolutions. A first budget resolution that was due in May and a second one that was due at the middle of September. The first one in May was non-binding, and that was just a recommendation of how much money to spend. The second one would then be binding, and we would have to then abide by those limitations in that second budget resolution. Subsequent to that, we took those 2 and we've combined them together into that concurrent resolution on the budget that we now have due by April 15th. It created the Congressional Budget Office to serve as a counterbalance to the Office of Management Budget. It set the fiscal year to begin on October 1st and to end on September 30th. It attempted to control what's called backdoor spending. Backdoor spending is discretionary spending that happens outside of the appropriations process. All discretionary spending is supposed to happen in appropriations. The Constitution is very clear that before Congress can remove money from the US Treasury, it must first appropriate those funds. Appropriation is just essentially saying how that money will be spent. So Congress constitutionally must say this is how the money is being spent before that money can be spent. Congress is doing a lot of backdoor spending where they were doing discretionary spending outside of the normal appropriations process. And the goal was to try and control some of that backdoor spending. And we also instituted some reforms to try and control the president and the president's ability to decide not to spend money that's appropriated by Congress. Now, presidents do not have a line item veto. They never have, and they still do not have a line item veto. A line item veto allows the chief executive to veto out specific line items in an appropriations bill. Governors have a line item veto power. Presidents do not. Congress back in the Clinton administration, it's kind of a strange situation. You had a Republican-controlled Congress that tried to give a Democratic president line item veto power. It was then declared unconstitutional by the Supreme Court, and we do not have line item veto power for presidents. So since Nixon did not have line item veto power, he used a process known as presidential impoundment. And again, I don't want to get into a lot of weeds here, but it's kind of important for understanding how it works. There are two different types of impoundments. There are deferrals and there are rescissions. And in a deferral, what the president will do is the president will say, I'm not going to spend this money appropriated by Congress right now. I will spend it in the future. I'm not going to spend it now. So one reason why a president might want to defer appropriations is to kind of sync up spending with tax revenue. So if we know we've got tax revenue coming in 2 months, you hold off on spending until that tax revenue comes in. That's a deferral. Congress wasn't all that concerned about deferrals. What Congress really hated was rescissions. And so when the president would threaten to rescind appropriations, the president would say, I disagree with this program, and so I am not going to spend this money. I'm going to direct OMB and the federal government not to spend these appropriated funds. That's what really ticked Congress off, because Congress says we have appropriation power under the Constitution. If we say this is how the money should be spent, the money should be spent. And so this was a major conflict between Congress and the Nixon White House. So they tried to limit presidential impoundments by having a process by which Congress could release those funds with a vote of one House of Congress. So either the Senate or the House of Representatives, by majority vote, could vote to then force the president to spend the money. And that's how they were going to fix the problem. Well, the Budget Impoundment Control Act ran into some major problems. One major problem it ran into is that those two-part resolutions just simply did not work. The first resolution was non-binding. And so in May, you're basically tipping all these interest groups and all these stakeholders to the fact that you're going to have your budget cut. You're going to get less money for your programs. But what do these interest groups do? They descend upon Congress and they start lobbying Congress. So Congress made the process much more political by having this non-binding resolution in May. The binding resolution didn't come through until September 15th, 2 weeks before all appropriation bills had to be passed. So the second resolution just came too late in the process. So therefore, we cobbled them together into a concurrent budget resolution that now is due on April 15th. This whole idea of having one or the other body of Congress force the release of spending by the president was considered unconstitutional, and the Supreme Court in the Chadha case said that's an unconstitutional one-house veto. If Congress wants to veto an action of the president, it must do so in accordance with the Constitution. You have to have a 2/3 vote of both the House as well as the Senate. A majority vote by one House is not constitutional. So that was thrown out as being unconstitutional. The backdoor spending limits didn't work all that well because Congress exempted up to 80% of appropriations from those backdoor spending limitations. If you exempt 80% of your budget from these rules, the rules simply are not going to have any substantive effect. So despite all those failures, the Budget Impoundment Control Act, many provisions of it are still in place today. We still have a House and a Senate Budget Committee. We still have the idea of a budget resolution to try and limit the amount of spending that is being done. The framework of how our federal budget process works can be traced back to the process that was put in place by this Budget Impoundment Control Act back in 1974. Subsequent to 1974, remember, we had two major goals. We were going to try and get budgets done on time, and we were going to try and eliminate deficits. By the mid-1980s, we were still not getting our budgets done on time, And we were still running budget deficits. And those budget deficits were getting bigger and bigger and bigger with each passing year. So Congress tries reform again, and it tries reform again in the mid-1980s with what's known as Graham-Rudman-Hollings. Graham-Rudman-Hollings was named after three of its co-sponsors: Phil Graham from the state of Texas, a conservative Republican; Warren Rudman from New Hampshire, who was an independent or became an independent; and then Fritz Hollings, who is a Democrat from South Carolina. I know today it sounds very strange to hear of a Democratic senator from South Carolina, but they actually did exist back in the day. And back in the 1980s, Fritz Hollings was one of them. So these three individuals got together and they co-authored this bipartisan piece of legislation that's come to be known as Graham-Rudman-Hollings. They did that in 1985. And the primary goal of Graham-Rudman-Hollings was to try and eliminate deficits. We would eliminate deficits by setting up what we call these maximum allowable deficit targets. So every year we would establish, here is the maximum amount of deficit that we will tolerate in the federal budget. And it created a timetable so that every year in that timetable, the maximum allowable deficit target will get smaller and smaller and smaller until eventually the maximum allowable deficit target would be zero. And we would then have eliminated deficits. Well, it kind of makes sense that if you place limitations, those limitations get smaller and smaller and smaller, eventually you'll be able to eliminate deficits. The process was that if in any one fiscal year, if Congress did not hit its deficit target, in order to get down to that deficit target, we would introduce this process known as sequestration. That's your 25-cent word of the night, sequestration. Sequestration was a process by which the president would then offer across-the-board cuts to all non-exempt spending areas in order to bring our level of spending down to where we met our deficit target or be below our deficit target. So these are meant to be very politically painful across-the-board cuts known as sequestration. The problem with Graham-Rudman-Hollings, as it was passed in 1985, there were a couple major problems with it. One problem was that it was unconstitutional. Congress has this nasty habit of passing unconstitutional pieces of legislation. We saw the Budget Impoundment Control Act. That portion on impoundments was considered unconstitutional by the Supreme Court. Well, here, what Congress did is it didn't trust the president to make these sequestration cuts. So what it did is it placed the Comptroller General of the United States. The Comptroller General of the United States is the head of the Government Accountability Office that we had mentioned earlier. So it took this head of the Government Accountability Office and put this person in charge of reviewing the cuts made by the president to make sure that the cuts were being done in accordance with law. The problem there is that the Government Accountability Office is a legislative organization. The Comptroller General, as the head of the GAO, is therefore a congressional employee. So Congress was placing a congressional employee in charge of the chief executive. It's a clear violation of separation of powers. And so that was declared to be unconstitutional. So Congress then went back to the drawing board 2 years later and passed Graham-Rudman-Hollings II, the sequel, in 1987. And as we know, sequels are rarely better than the original, and this sequel had some flaws as well. The primary flaw under Graham-Rudman-Hollings II in 1987 is that this timetable that we set up with these maximum allowable deficit targets, if Congress was going to miss one of those targets in a given year, they would just revise the target upward. So every time they missed the target, they'd revise it upward and they'd start over again. Then the next year they missed the target, they revised the target upward. So instead of deficits getting smaller, deficits actually got bigger. And it's because Congress did not have the political willpower to make the difficult decisions in order to eliminate deficits. So instead of reducing deficits, by 1990, deficits had just grown and gotten bigger and bigger. So as you said, the primary problems, Graham-Rudman-Hollings I was unconstitutional, but the bigger problem with both acts is that Congress had the ability to just change their minds, change those deficit targets. So we try again in 1990 with what's called the Budget Enforcement Act. The Budget Enforcement Act changed our focus. And it changed our focus from focusing on deficits to focusing on spending. And basically, Congress asked the question, what is the primary cause of a deficit? And they answered that the primary cause of a deficit is runaway spending. So instead of focusing on the deficit directly, let's focus on the cause of that deficit, which is too much spending. So they redirected their focus on spending rather than focusing on deficits. What they want to do is eliminate deficits by reducing spending. There's a really great article from several years ago that likens this shift from deficit to spending to George Orwell in 1984. And in 1984, I'm going to get them wrong, but in 1984, we shifted our focus from East Asia being our enemy to Eurasia being our enemy, or vice versa. And overnight, all the textbooks changed. And everything that was taught in school changed overnight. And suddenly our enemy was a different enemy. Well, that's kind of what happened here. Our enemy went from being deficits to being runaway spending. So the Budget Enforcement Act said we can get control of spending by creating firewalls between three different categories of spending. So they created a domestic category of spending, an international category, and a defense category. So three different categories of spending. And then they placed firewalls between those categories, meaning that if you wanted to increase spending on a domestic program, you could not pay for it by reducing spending in international or defense spending. You would have to pay for it by reducing spending within the domestic category. You had to remain within those three categories. You couldn't cross over. And it introduced this idea we talked about at the outset tonight of pay-go, pay as you go. That if you want to increase dollar for dollar increases in a domestic program must be paid for by dollar for dollar decreases in other domestic programs. You have to pay for increases in spending as you go. This Budget Enforcement Act of 1990, combined with Balanced Budget Acts in 1993 and 1997, combined with a very quickly growing economy. And if you think about in the middle of the Clinton administration, we had the dot-com boom. We had all these internet companies in the Silicon Valley that were just making money hand over fist. And all those profits were then being taxed with federal income taxes. And so you had a huge boom to the federal coffers. And you had all this income tax revenue that was flowing into the federal government. You had economic growth rates because of this dot-com boom and the rates of like 6, 7, 8% every quarter, which was absolutely unheard of. So you have this burgeoning economy, all this new tax revenue combined together with the fiscal discipline of having these three different categories of spending and making Congress pay for increased spending as it goes by reducing spending in other programs. You combine all that together, increase of revenue with reductions in spending, and it doesn't take a rocket scientist to figure out that's going to get you out of deficit spending. If you have all this revenue and you're spending less money, you're going to be able to run a surplus. We ran a surplus then in 1999 and a surplus in 2000. September 11th hit in 2001. We then had the subsequent wars in Afghanistan, in Iraq. We then had plunged us back into deficit spending, and we've been in deficit spending ever since. Now, in some administrations here and there, we have some decreases to our deficits. Our deficits go down. We saw at the tail end of the Obama administration, deficits go down. We saw a deficit go down last year as well. But for the most part, we continue to run deficits year after year, and we continue to struggle to get our budgets done on time. So despite all these reforms to the budgeting process, we are still unsuccessful at avoiding deficits and getting our budgets done. And I think the real moral of the story here is that avoiding deficits, getting budgets done on time is really much more a matter of political willpower than it is necessarily procedural changes. Procedural changes can help, but we really need to have that political willpower in order to avoid these deficits. That's why some of the provisions in this debt ceiling agreement, such as the continuing resolution that will kick in automatically with a 1% reduction, we've tried that before, and unless we have the political willpower to adhere to that 1% reduction, it's simply not going to happen. And the problem is that Congress has appropriation power. And so if Congress believes that increasing appropriations will help them get reelected, they will increase appropriations. And political imperatives oftentimes trump economic imperatives. I think that's what we typically see in the federal budget process. I know that was a very long discussion of the federal budget process, but again, there's a whole lot there. We just hit the very tip of the iceberg, just the highlights. We could spend an entire semester talking about the federal budget process, but it's important for us to at least know the general parameters and structure of the federal budget process so that we can better understand how budgeting occurs at the state and the local level. I know we're almost at 7:30, and so we really do need to take a break. I know this is kind of some dense material that we are going through. So let's take a break, kind of clear our minds a little bit. 7:25, let's take our normal 15-minute break, come back at 7:40, and then we're going to turn our attention to a discussion of state and local budgeting. We'll talk about how budgeting happens here in the state of California, some of the corollaries between the federal approach and the state approach. Then we'll talk about some of the major determinants on how budgeting is done then at the local level. So take a break, come on back at 7:40, and we'll get into state and local budgeting processes. Okay, it is 7:40, so we are back. Let's go ahead and finish up our discussion of budget process. And again, we'll turn our attention now to the state and local level. And obviously, we'll spend most of our time talking about California state budgeting. But in general, state budgeting, again, is going to follow the general parameters of the federal level. And before I get into that, I forgot, I should tell you, there is breaking news based upon what we talked about when we started the class tonight. I told you the Rules Committee was going to have a vote on the debt ceiling limit and pushing it on to the floor of the House. And they had their vote. It occurred about half an hour ago, and it was a 7-6 vote. So we had Roy and Norman were the two Republicans who voted against it, along with the 4 Democrats. But 7 Republicans, including Massey, were good enough to then move it to the floor. So there will be a floor vote tomorrow in the House. Again, that's scheduled for about 5:30 Pacific time. So just to let you know, it's the breaking news. We should probably have a chyron across the screen saying breaking news, the Rules Committee passed the debt ceiling legislation. Okay, that's done. So when we talk about the state budgeting process, we see state budgeting processes that, again, follow the general parameters of the federal process, but they can also run along the spectrum of executive to legislatively driven. There are some states that have a very executive-driven process, much like the federal government is a very executive-driven process. At the federal level, as we talked about, the president puts the budget together with the assistance of OMB that delivers their budget to Congress, and then Congress has to work within the parameters that were established by the president in that presidential budget. You have a similar thing going on in a lot of states where the chief executive puts the budget together, and then that chief executive's budget is considered by the state legislature. One of the most executive-driven processes is in the state of Wisconsin. Here in California, we are not far behind. So we are certainly on the executive side in terms of executive legislative dominance. Contrast that to another state like Texas. In the state of Texas, traditionally, the budget was created not just by the governor, but also by what's called a legislative budget board, or an LBB. The legislative budget board would be comprised of leaders from the state legislature. They would work with the governor's office to put the budget together. And so the legislature in Texas actually has a say in the creation of the budget before it even goes to the state legislature. So that's a very legislatively dominated type of process. But here in California, we're very executive dominated in that the governor will put together their budget that usually occurs by the middle of January, and then that budget bill goes to the state legislature. At the federal level, as we said, we have OMB that provides budget guidance and assistance to the president. We have the CBO that provides assistance to the Congress. Here in California, the corollary to OMB is the Department of Finance. The Department of Finance helps the governor put the budget together, collects budget requests from all the different agencies across the state government. And so the Department of Finance kind of serves a similar function to OMB. Department of Finance will put together revenue projections, will put together expenditure estimates in a similar way as the OMB does at the federal level. In terms of the corollary to the Congressional Budget Office, here in California, it's the LAO, the Legislative Analyst Office. The LAO will score bills, and scoring means that they will look at pieces of legislation or constitutional amendments, and they will assign costs or benefits to those pieces of legislation, to those constitutional amendments. They will produce their own revenue forecast, they'll produce their own expenditure estimates, and do that primarily for the state legislature. So here in California, it's the Department of Finance and the Legislative Analyst Office. So the governor's budget then goes to the state legislature, and the state legislature then considers that governor's budget, but the real consideration of the budget picks up after the May revise. So here in California, we have the May revise that usually comes out about the middle of May. That May revise will then revise our revenue forecast that the governor's budget was predicated on back in January. As we had mentioned at the outset of class tonight, because of the impacts of COVID and the loss of a lot of this federal COVID assistance, we are seeing, and also because of the extension that was given to California income taxpayers, we have seen a reduction in the amount of revenue. That revenue is flowing in much slower and at much reduced levels than what we had originally forecasted back when the governor's budget was created. So therefore, some of those increases in spending are not materializing and will not be in the final budget that's passed in June. There'll be some cuts that will also be in there in order to try and offset the deficit. Less money going into a rainy day fund. Over the past couple of years, because we had such a surplus, we were able to then put a lot of money into a rainy day fund. Obviously, we're not going to have the same amounts of money to go into that rainy day fund this year. But based upon the results of that May revise, then the state legislature will receive a revised budget from the government, from the governor, and then the state legislature will in earnest really start working on passing that governor's budget. By state law, the governor's budget must be passed by the state legislature by June 15th. It then must be signed by the governor by June 30th for the beginning of the new fiscal year on July 1st. So we have a completely different type of fiscal year here in the state of California than what we have at the federal level. Now, when that budget is approved by the state legislature on June 15th, signed by the governor by June 30th, goes into effect on July 1st, there are not a lot of details in that budget bill that's approved by July 1st. Here in California, a lot of the details about how that budget will be implemented come in the form of what we call trailer bills. And if you're familiar with the way in which budgeting works here in California, it's those trailer bills that will really spell out all the details in terms of how these programs are going to be implemented and how this money is going to be spent. So the budget work of the state legislature does not end when they pass the governor's budget on June 15th. It's really just beginning, because throughout July and August and September, working around recesses, the state legislature will pass out a series of trailer bills. And those trailer bills will then tell local governments, this is how this money should be spent. And so I spent 6 years on a local school board, and we would always, have to wait. We get the governor's budget. Okay, the governor's budget is signed and it takes effect on July 1st. But we would have to wait sometimes in spending money until we actually got the trailer bills to tell us exactly how that money should be spent. Who is eligible, how we calculate those eligibility requirements, how we calculate the amount that goes to each student. A lot of that information is in those trailer bills that will trickle out of the state legislature throughout the summer and then into September. So the use of those trailer bills is a different approach than what we tend to see at the federal level. Now, here in California, we tend to have a much easier time passing a budget than what we see at the federal level in Congress. And the reason why we have a much easier time here in the state of California is really twofold. One reason is because we have unified government. We have one-party dominance. In the state assembly, as well as in the state senate, the Democratic Party has supermajorities, well above 2/3 majorities. in both the Assembly as well as the Senate. In the Senate, I believe there are 40 seats in the Senate. I believe there are 32 Democrats and only 8 Republicans. And so it's not just a 2/3 majority. It really is very much a super majority at about 80%. You also then have a Democratic governor. So when you have one party controlling both the Assembly as well as the Senate, as well as the governor's office, obviously it's going to be a little bit easier to agree on priorities and to get a budget passed on time. Also, we revised Proposition 13, or the voters revised Proposition 13. So we no longer need to have a 2/3 majority in order to pass a budget through the state legislature. Today, we only need a simple majority. And so that's made it obviously much easier to pass a budget. We still need a 2/3 majority in order to increase revenue. And so if we want to raise taxes, or we want to raise fees and charges, that must get a 2/3 majority of the Assembly and the Senate. But to merely pass the budget, we only now need a simple majority. And so we tend to get our budgets done on time. Prior to that change, and back when we had divided government, in the Schwarzenegger administration, we had a Republican-controlled governor's office. We were having trouble getting the budget done on time. And there were some major constitutional questions about, if the budget is not done and in place by the beginning of the new fiscal year on July 1st, can the state government still operate? And the Schwarzenegger administration was saying no. And the Schwarzenegger administration said, if there's no budget in place by July 1st, then these state agencies have no legal authority to spend money, and so therefore they need to shut down. And the state legislature said, well, no, we should still be able to operate. Here in California, we do not use continuing resolutions like what you see at the federal level. And so the question of the Schwarzenegger administration was, should the state government shut down when there's not a budget in place? That case was making its way up to the California State Supreme Court. By the time it got to the California State Supreme Court, the state legislature agreed upon a budget. It was signed by Governor Schwarzenegger. And so the issue was rendered moot. And so the state Supreme Court never actually ruled on the constitutionality of the state government staying open in the absence of budget appropriations. So we never got an answer to that question. But today it's not really a relevant question as long as you have the supermajorities in the Senate and the Assembly, and you only need a simple majority to pass a budget. It's relatively easy for us to pass a budget. We also here in California, like most other states, also have a prohibition against running a deficit. So we are not allowed to run a deficit. Now, there are ways we can avoid a deficit while still having expenditures exceeding revenues. And one way the state of California has avoided the appearance of running a deficit is by borrowing money. And so typically what the state will oftentimes do is it will issue notes. Notes are short-term borrowing mechanisms that will allow you to get an influx of revenue to avoid then the appearance of a deficit. And one of the borrowing mechanisms that the state used to use a lot are what are known as revenue anticipation notes, or RANs. A revenue anticipation note is you will borrow money for a short period of time until the next time when you are getting tax proceeds coming in. And then you will pay off that note when that revenue then arrives. So the debt is secured by the new revenue that is coming in. The problem with that is that, yes, it will help you avoid a deficit because it gives you an influx of revenue. The problem, though, is you're always playing catch up because you're using next year's revenue to pay off the debt from last year, and then you'll use the year after that to pay off the debt from this year, and so on and so on. So it's kind of like a dog chasing its tail. And California was in that situation for a while before we really hit the fiscal stability that we've seen over the past few years. So there are some things that are similar in California to the federal level, but there are some things that are decidedly different. And I think it's really the presence of those trailer bills and the details we get in those trailer bills that really does set us apart from the way in which the federal government does its budgeting, as well as the different fiscal year. So at the local level, the type of budgeting process used at the local level is oftentimes going to depend upon the local governance structure itself. What type of a local governance structure do you have in that local government? Is that city a strong mayor form of government? Is it a weak mayor form of government? Is it a reformed government in that it has a city manager? Is it a local government that's more of a commissioner form of government? The type of governance structure will really dictate who does what in the budgeting process. So you're probably familiar with some of the differences between a strong and a weak mayor form of government. But someone tell me, what's the difference between a strong mayor and a weak mayor form of government? How do those differ? Again, you use your microphone, you use text chat, whatever you're comfortable with. But what's the difference between a strong mayor versus a weak mayor form of government?
For weak mayors, it's generally as part of like a city council. So it might even be like a rotating position that's from year to year is passed around between city council members. Strong mayors are generally, I think, elected by the residents of the city.
Right, perfect. And Paul's exactly right. The difference is in a strong mayor form of government, the mayor is independently elected. As an independently elected local official, they run for the office of mayor, they build their own support, they build their own political resources. And so therefore, they're oftentimes going to take a much more active role in the preparation of budget priorities. In a weak mayor form of government, like Paul says, you don't have someone running for that office of mayor. Typically, the mayor comes from the city council. And in most cities here in California, use a rotational basis. And so every year, someone will be mayor, someone will be mayor pro tem. Then the following year, the mayor pro tem will then become mayor, and then there'll be a new mayor pro tem who's selected. And it just cycles on a rotational basis. And that's very common here in California. In some other weak mayor forms of government, though, they will select the mayor based upon the person who gets the most votes in the city council election. And that's a very common approach in a lot of Midwestern states. And so the person who gets the most votes for city council, that person then gets to be called mayor. But again, they're a weak mayor, they're from city council. The budget priority powers really rest with city council rather than resting with the mayor's office. In a reformed government, we're talking about a government that has a city manager. And most of our cities here in California are reformed governments in that they have city managers. Typically, the functionality of the budget comes out of the city manager's office. And so oftentimes when you're looking at the budget you're going to use for your pre-instructional assignment, oftentimes that letter of transmittal, that budget message, will come from the city manager's office. And the city manager's office will be responsible for putting the budget together and then transmitting that budget to the city council for the city council's consideration. There's also a commissioner form of government. And here in California, we're familiar with a commissioner form of government at the county level. So at the county level, we have a county board of supervisors. We have 5 supervisors. Those supervisors are essentially what we would consider to be a commissioner form of government. When I was in Illinois, our cities were all commissioners forms of government. And so the city would be run by 3 commissioners. Those commissioners were legislators in that they were part of the city commission, but they were also heads of departments. And so one was the head of public works, one was the head of parks and recreation, one was the head, I think, of public safety. So they had their own departments. So they had executive roles to play, but they were also legislators in that they were part of that city commission. And so it's very similar to what we have at our county level with our boards of supervisors. And so the type of governance structure will oftentimes determine what the budget looks like, the budget priorities, and how that budget is being presented. So as you look at the budget for your local government, keep an eye on that letter of transmittal, that budget message, and where it is coming from. If it's a reform government, it's probably going to be coming from the city manager's office, but the job of approving that budget and really establishing those priorities will be left to that city council, because the city manager works for the city council. So despite some of these differences we see between local and state and federal, the general 4 phases of the budgeting process we see at the federal level oftentimes govern how budgets are made at the state and the local level as well. It's important for us to know how budgets are put together in order to better understand the results of those budgets. And so, you think about the federal level, whether we're focusing on deficits or spending, will have an impact upon what the final budget will look like. Whether we have a party in power that favors revenue generation as opposed to a party in power that's favoring cuts in spending, will have a major impact upon that resulting budget. And so it's kind of that important preliminary information to understand how the budget is constructed to better understand the results of that budget process. But when we do put budgets together, budgets can look different from each other, and there are different ways in which we can structure our budgets. And how we structure our budget is what's referred to as the budget format. And so let me go ahead. I'm going to have to share my screen because it's not showing up there. So let me go ahead and get rid of this down there. And we'll get rid of this. And let me share out our basic discussion of budget formats. So, okay, hopefully you can see SHIC and the purposes of budgets on your screen. Let's talk really briefly about what budgets look like in terms of what types of budget formats there are that we can choose from and what different budget formats look like. Now, it's kind of awkward in a 6-week course because I know this is one of the questions you have on your pre-instructional assignment. What type of budget format is being used and how do you know that? And I know I tell you when you do your pre-instructional assignment, don't use any information from the classroom. We're going to have to bend the rules here because we are only a 6-week course. And so we would really end up running out of time for all of our information if we wait until after June 12th to do budget formats. And so you will have this information. You can use this information in your pre-instructional assignment. It's just kind of the nature of the beast in a short 6-week course. And so I do apologize for that, but we are going through the information that you can use then for answering that budget format question. I think what we'll do tonight is we will talk about the general idea behind budget formats, and then maybe we'll hold off and then the beginning of class next time, I'll then share those different budget formats with you and we'll go through in detail what each of those budget formats look like. But just for tonight, to get us started on budget formats, let's talk about some of the purposes that we can use a budget for, because the purpose we're using the budget for will have an impact upon the type of budget format we want to use. And let me introduce you to this gentleman by the name of Alan Schick. And Alan Schick is very well known in the public budgeting literature because he linked up budget formats with the purpose a budget can be used for. And Schick made the argument there are 3 primary purposes of a budget document. We can use a budget to control our expenditures, to control what we're spending our money on and how much money we are spending. So it can be a document used for control. Secondly, a budget, according to Schick, can also then be used as a management document. We can use it to better manage the operations of our organizations, to try and manage our organizations more efficiently and more effectively. So it can be a management tool. Third, Schick says budgets can also be a tool for strategic planning. And we can use our budget document to strategically plan the priorities and the operations, the activities of our organizations. So what you want to use your budget for, control, management, or planning, will help dictate which budget format is most appropriate for you to use. So let's start with control. If you want to use your budget to control how much is being spent and what that money is being spent on, then the type of budget format that will probably work best for you, or most appropriately, would be a line item budget. Line item budgets really do highlight the control feature of a budget document. It's a very traditional approach to budgeting. Oftentimes, line item budgets are referred to as object of expenditure budgets. So last week, when we talked about the post-instructional assignment, I shared with you that line item spreadsheet, that template that you'll be using to do part 2 of your post-instructional assignment. That's a line item spreadsheet. That's a line item budget. In that budget, we'll list, here is what we're spending the money on, here is the object of expenditure, and here is the amount of money that we're spending on that object. Doesn't give us a lot of information beyond just what we're spending money on and how much money we are spending. It really does lend itself toward incremental decision-making, because all the information we have is what we spent last year, how much we spent, and what we spent that money on. That's all the information we have to go on. Nice thing about line item budgeting, object or expenditure budgeting, is that we avoid large mistakes. It's very simple. It's very quick to do. The problem is that we will repeat small mistakes year after year. So if the program that we are funding is not effective, it's not accomplishing its goals, it's not having the outcomes and consequences that we desire for our beneficiaries, we're going to keep funding that year after year because we don't know that. We don't have that information presented to us in that budget. So a simple line item budget will emphasize control. Every local government will have a line item component to their budgets. I've yet to see a local government that does not at least have part of their budget that looks very line item in nature. Again, the object of money is being spent on and the amount of money that is being spent. However, over the years, we have come to realize that we can use budget documents for more than just controlling what we are spending our money on. So a second possible budget format you may see at the local level is what's called a performance-based budget. Performance-based budgets are probably the second most common type of budget that we tend to see at the local level. And it really does highlight the management feature. It really highlights using the budget document to better manage the activities and the operations of your organization. So a true performance-based budget will include empirical indicators of performance. So it will list for us, here are the activities that we are going to engage in with this money, and then here are some performance measures. So we will know how effective we are in spending the money on these different types of activities. So it links your budgeted amounts to the activities that you're spending the money on, and then links those activities to the performance expectations for those activities. So we know how effectively we are spending the money. So we're not just asking how much, we're not just asking on what, we are now asking the question, how well are we spending that money? Now, performance-based budgeting is not a new approach to a budget format. It's been around since the 1950s, and there are kind of two different schools of performance-based budgeting. There's the classical school, and the classical school back in the 1950s and the 1960s focused very much on output. So we are measuring effectiveness in terms of the output that we are creating, the products and the services that we were creating and providing and producing for our beneficiaries. So we are linking inputs basically with activities and then linking those activities with the outputs, the products, the goods, the services that we are creating with that money. That's what was known as the classical approach to performance-based budgeting. That classical approach really hit its heyday in the 1950s and the 1960s. Then it kind of fell out of favor. And we saw a lot of governments moving away from performance-based budgeting. We have seen a renaissance in performance-based budgeting start up in the 1990s and has become very popular today, what's known as new performance-based budgeting. In the new approach to performance-based budgeting, instead of just looking at the outputs, now we really start looking at the outcomes. Now we're looking at the consequences of those outputs. So, okay, so we're delivering this service to X number of people. Well, so what? What are the consequences for those beneficiaries? How is this changing their lives? What are the empirical indicators of how these services are improving the quality of life of these individuals? So the new performance-based budgeting has really shifted more from outputs into outcomes, the actual consequences of what we are doing with the money that we are spending. This new approach to performance-based budgeting has become relatively common at the local level. You could very well see a combination of a line item and performance-based budget being used by your local government. How you know whether or not the local government is using a performance-based budget are there empirical performance indicators built into that budget. The example that Mike Sell uses doesn't apply real well here in Southern California, but applied better back in the Midwest and on the East Coast. One of the examples he uses is a snow removal program. And he says, for this snow removal program, for a performance-based budget, we'll not just say, here's the amount of money that's being spent on snow removal, but we'll say, what activities are we paying for in snow removal? Well, one activity we can be paying for is we can be paying for plowing, that we're going to plow the snow from the streets. Another activity we might engage in is the salting of the streets. You throw down rock salt on the streets, it will then melt the snow. So those are two activities we're going to be spending our money on. Then the question becomes, so those are activities. And the question becomes, well, what are the outputs? Well, we can look at how many lane miles of roads we are plowing, how many lane miles of roads we are salting. And those are some of the outputs, some of the products services that we are creating. Then in new performance-based budgeting, you'll beyond that, you ask the so what question. Okay, so if we are plowing 350 miles of roads in a given year, well, what does that mean in terms of the number of accidents in which snow was a contributing factor? That's an outcome. That's an empirical measure that if there are fewer accidents in which snow is a contributing factor, obviously we're doing a better job of clearing these roads. Another empirical indicator could be the number of citizen complaints about the condition of roads. That's an outcome. That's a consequence that is being felt by the beneficiaries of this snow removal program. So again, what we're trying to do is we're trying to link up inputs with activities, with outputs, with then the outcomes and the consequences. When we do that in our document, we are giving ourselves the information we then need to better manage our organizations. And so if we are spending X amount of money on plowing roads, but the number of accidents in which snow is a contributing factor is going up, then there's probably a problem with the way in which we're plowing those roads. Maybe we have to look at how we're plowing the roads. Maybe we need to have new plows on our trucks. Maybe we need to go plow roads in a different order, main streets first, then side streets. There's probably something in the way in which we're doing our work that we have to change. So it gives us that tangible empirical information we can use to then change the operations of our organization. So it really does highlight that management feature. Once you're taking into account all that additional information, you are moving more away from incremental decision-making and moving more toward a more rational approach to making your decisions. And last week we talked about the decision-making models we use in budgeting. Well, here we're moving from incrementalism more toward rationality in making our budget decisions. A third type of budget format is what's known as program-based budgeting. And here with program-based budgeting, now we're moving into our third purpose of budgeting according to Schick, which is the planning function. Now we're using our budgeting process and our budgeting format to help plan the operations of our organization. So it highlights this planning feature. Now, you're less likely to see a program-based budget at the local level than you are to see a line item and performance-based budgets. This is relatively unusual at the local level. I'm not going to say you're not going to see it because some students have found cities that use program-based budgeting, but it's much rarer in nature. Where you're going to see program-based budgeting used more commonly is going to be at the federal level. And the Department of Defense in the 1960s, Bud McNamara, when he was Secretary of Defense, brought program-based budgeting into the federal level at the DoD. And today the DoD still uses an aspect of program-based budgeting in putting together its Department of Defense budget. If your city happens to be using a program-based budget, you will know it because a program-based budget looks a lot different than a line item or a performance-based budget. Line item and performance-based budgets tend to be focused on units and departments. So you'll have a budget for the fire department, a budget for the police department, a budget for the city manager's office. You will have budgets organized around units, divisions, and departments in that traditional type of approach. However, in a program-based budget, you organize not according to unit and division, but rather according to program. So to give you an example, in a program-based budget, rather than budgeting according to the police department or the fire department, you may budget according to the program, protection of persons and property. So protections of persons and property is your program. It doesn't matter if it's the police department or the fire department that's contributing activities to the protection of persons and property. All activities that contribute to the protection of persons and property, all those activities will all be budgeted together under that same program of protection of persons and property. The benefit of a program-based budget is it allows us to engage in a process known as crosswalking. And crosswalking is a simple process in budgeting where we'll establish a matrix and we will then crosswalk between activity and the program goal that the activity is meant to try and achieve. And so here's, police patrol hours and the money we're spending on police patrol hours. Well, that's going to crosswalk to protection of persons and property. Maybe, fire education, number of hours spent in fire education. That money that's being spent on those hours of training and fire education also then contribute to protection and persons property. So those activities will all be put together into that protection of persons and property budget. Obviously, it's highlighting this planning feature because it allows us to see how all the different activities, regardless of what department or division they're being done in, how all the different activities going on in our organization contribute to different program goals. That's the nice thing about program-based budgeting. The problem with program-based budgeting is that it's very time-intensive and it's very resource-intensive. It will require that you have some type of a strategic planning process in place. If you haven't thought about strategic planning, you probably don't have programmatic goals that you've established. If you don't have programmatic goals, you're not going to be able to crosswalk those to the discrete activities going on within your agency. So it requires a pretty robust strategic planning process be in place before you can put together a program-based budget. But a program budget is going to look a lot different than a line item or a performance budget. So if your city is using a program-based budget, you will certainly know it. Another possible drawback to program-based budgeting is the reluctance on the part of division and department heads to give up authority over activity spending. It might be difficult to convince a police chief or a fire chief that they're going to be budgeted together in this program protection of persons and property. They're used to having their own departmental budgets. They're probably going to want to keep control over their own departmental budgets. So you can really run into a lot of resistance on the part of your managers if program-based budgeting is not implemented appropriately. But program-based budgeting, you're going to be much more likely to see that at higher levels of government, at the national level. Some states use program-based budgeting, but it's a relatively unusual format to see at the local level. Then our fourth budget format is zero-based budgeting. And like program-based budgeting, zero-based budgeting highlights the planning feature of a budget document. In zero-based budgeting, what we are going to do is we're going to go back and we are going to re-justify why we are spending money on these activities. We're not going to just continue to spend money on an activity because that's what we did last year. We're going to go back and we're going to re-justify why this activity is important enough that we spend precious public resources on this activity. Zero-based budgeting differs from line item performance and program-based budgeting primarily in that it is more of a process than it is a finalized budget format. It is possible that you might look at your city's budget and it may look very line item in nature, but the process that was used to create that budget was a zero-based budgeting process. So this is much more of a process than it is a format. So the question may be, well, if I can't see zero-based budgeting in the format I'm looking at, how do I know that it was used? You will know if a city uses zero-based budgeting because they're going to tell everybody they're using zero-based budgeting. Zero-based budgeting is perhaps the most resource and time-intensive format that you can possibly use. And so they're going to tell everyone if they put their budget together in a zero-based way, they will let you know that in that letter of transmittal or in that budget message. So read the letter of transmittal, the budget message, and if zero-based budgeting is being used, they're definitely going to let you know that. But a zero-based budgeting process can result in what looks a lot like a line item budget. But how does this zero-based budgeting process work? Zero-based budgeting is a very bottom-up budget making process, whereby you go to the lowest level in your organization at which budget decisions can be made. So you look at your organizational chart, you go to the lowest level in your organization where budget decisions can be made. And you identify that as what you call a decision unit. You may have dozens of decision units within your organization, but you start at that decision unit level, the lowest level in the organization where budget decisions can be made. Each one of those decision units will then create a series of what are known as decision packages. Decision packages will present different courses of action, different ways in which we can accomplish our goals, and then will also include consequences for selecting one approach over another. And so, in the example I'll show you at the beginning of class next week, we look at for a library system. And so you may have a decision package that says, course of action number one is to keep spending stagnant from last year for a bookmobile program. Okay, if we keep our spending stagnant from last year, we don't change the funding level at all for the bookmobile program, what are the consequences? Well, the consequences are because of increasing costs of doing business, that if we spend the same amount of money, we're probably going to be able to serve fewer clients than we were last year. We won't be able to have the same circulation rates. We're not going to be able to get out to the same number of people and the same number of community organizations with our bookmobile. So maybe we're going to end up serving 1,000 fewer patrons. Our circulation rates are going to go down by 10%, just making these numbers up. Those are consequences of keeping the funding level stagnant. Well, another course of action may be to increase the funding level by 10%. So funded at 110% of last year. Well, if we do that, that's cost of living and then some. So we're probably going to be able to serve more people and to go more miles on our bookmobile, which means that we are going to increase circulation rates maybe by 10%. We're maybe going to be able to serve an additional 500 people. Those are the consequences of that course of action. But what if we cut our spending? So we're only spending 95% of what we spent last year. Well, here are the consequences for that. So every decision package will have all these different alternative spending levels, and then the consequences for each one of those alternative spending levels. And then take all those decision packages at the decision unit level, and you will rank and prioritize them. You will then send those ranked, prioritized decision packages up to the next level of management. They will then be re-ranked and reprioritized, and then sent up to the top level of management, which will then re-rank and reprioritize them again. Your top ranked priorities, your top ranked decision packages will then become the budget for that organization. So as you can see, it's a very rational approach. It's really very much rationality as compared to incrementalism. Takes a lot of time, takes a lot of thought. Sometimes you're creating all these different decision packages. You may literally be creating hundreds or thousands of pages of decision packages in your budgeting process. You're spending a lot of time doing budgeting, and there are opportunity costs associated with that. Spending the time on budgeting means you're not going to be able to spend the time directly servicing your clients. And so you have to consider those opportunity costs in deciding whether or not you want to put this much work and effort into a zero-based budgeting process. The zero-based budgeting is very much of a bottom-up process where the lowest levels in your organization, that's where you start the budgeting process. And that's where you start ranking and prioritizing all your different possible courses of action, ways in which you can possibly spend your money. Now, zero-based budgeting, we're not going to see a whole lot of that at the local level. In the past, I think I've seen one local government that says it uses zero-based budgeting, but it's a very unusual approach to see at the local level because of a lack of money, lack of expertise in zero-based budgeting. Where we're much more likely to see it is we're much more likely to see it at the state level. Now, when President Carter became president back in January of 1977, he brought zero-based budgeting with him and tried to implement it at the federal level. Back when he was governor of Georgia, he took zero-based budgeting out of the private sector from Texas Instruments, applied it to all state of Georgia organizations, public organizations, was happy enough with the way in which it worked in Georgia that he thought he would apply it at the federal level. It was a colossal failure at the federal level because there wasn't a whole lot of training, there wasn't a whole lot of management support. And so you had a lot of public managers who were saying, we have better things to do than to spend all of our time putting a budget together. But a lot of states will still use some element of zero-based budgeting. But because it's so time and resource intensive, most governments will not do pure zero-based budgeting. Instead, what they'll do is they'll do a modified approach to zero-based budgeting, modified ZBB. A modified approach to zero-based budgeting is where you'll only subject a percentage of your budget to a zero-based type of process. And the most common type of a modified approach is an 80-20 approach. So in an 80-20 approach, 80% of your budget, your agency's budget, will be done with line item budgeting, as you've always done it in the past. But you'll randomly select 20% of your budget to then be subjected to a zero-based budgeting process in this fiscal year. Then the next fiscal year, you'll select another 20%, then the next year, another 20%, and so on, so that once every 5 years, every single part of your agency, or if you're a state government, every agency in your state government will have been subjected to a zero-based budgeting process. It's a little bit more realistic in terms of time, and in terms of effort. So when it's used, it's usually a modified zero-based budgeting approach. But again, I think it's very instructive to look at these 4 different formats along that spectrum of what the budget is being used for. If you want to control, line item budgeting is the way to go. If you want to better manage your organization, performance-based budgeting. If you want to better strategically plan your operations as an organization, program-based or zero-based budgeting would be the proper approaches. So it all depends. My favorite answer to everything is it depends. Well, it depends in this context as well. Depends on what you want to accomplish with your budget format. There is a wealth of literature out there looking at the impacts of budget format and asking the so what question. Does budget format make a difference in terms of what we end up spending our money on? And one author who is very famous for looking at that question is Gloria Grizzle. That is her last name, Grizzle, Gloria Grizzle. And Gloria Grizzle looked at the use of different budget formats across a variety of different states and then the resulting outcomes of those budgets. And what she found is that budget formats do have an impact upon our priorities and what we tend to spend money on. We have a lot more of a dynamic shift when we use zero-based budgeting, and we're much more likely to see new programs emerge as a result of zero-based budgeting as compared to line item budgeting. We tend to have more innovative and creative programs that come out of program-based budgeting and zero-based budgeting than what we typically see come out of line item budgeting. But those are the 4 budget formats that we focus on here in this class. That is not the entire universe of budget formats. There are a lot of other budget formats out there. There's what's called target-based budgeting. There's envelope budgeting. There's encumbrance-based budgeting. There are a lot of different types of budgeting approaches, but these are the 4 most common budget approaches that we tend to see used here in this country, and so that's why we focus on them in this class. Again, we only have a few minutes left, and so I don't think we have time to really do justice to going and looking at specific examples of each of these budget formats. I would like to start class next Tuesday, showing you what a performance-based budget looks like, showing you what a program-based budget looks like, kind of a combination performance program-based budget, and then showing you an example of a zero-based budgeting decision package, just so you can kind of see what these different formats look like. And then you can use that information when you look at your city budget to determine what type of format your city is using. I think our performance-based budgeting approach that we're going to use next week comes from the state of Texas. The combination program performance-based budgeting approach I'll show you comes from the city of Sunnyvale, California. And the zero-based budgeting approach, I believe, is for a library system. And we'll take a look at all those to start class next week. So you kind of get a good indication of what these formats actually look like. So you'll know them when you see them as you look at your city budget. But yeah, I think it's instructive to think about these 4 different formats in terms of what we're trying to accomplish: control, management, or strategic planning. And it is 8:30, so I think I'm going to leave it there for tonight. And then, like I said, we'll start next week talking about the different examples. I'll show you those examples. And then once we're done with those examples next week, we'll move into a discussion of analysis and budgeting. We'll talk about different analytical tools we typically use for different purposes in public budgeting. And then if time remains in the second half of class, we'll then turn our attention to accounting. We'll talk about different types of audits. We'll talk about fund-based accounting. We'll talk about double entry accounting and all those generally accepted accounting principles. We'll talk about the Government Accounting Standards Board and what it does and how it helps to improve the auditing and accounting process in public organizations. That's if we have time at the end of class next week. So that's kind of our plan moving forward for our next session. Okay, I know we covered a lot of ground tonight in the past 2.5 hours, but do you have any general questions about either budget processes or these 4 different types of budget formats? Okay.
I have a question or more of a comment. Just out of the different types of budget formats, is it possible that they all kind of intermingle at times? Where, for example, like in a city structure, you have line item budget predominantly, but then you have programs or divisions that are operated as like zero-based budget systems.
Absolutely, and that's an excellent comment. It's very common to see them combined, and so they are not mutually exclusive. The most common combination we tend to see is line item and performance combined together. But you're right, sometimes you'll see individual units or divisions that may use program-based budgeting where the overall budget for the agency is much more line item in nature. So yeah, it's a great point. They are not mutually exclusive. We certainly can see combinations between these different types of formats. And let's see, Tracy in text chat says, in one question, wanted to confirm the appropriation committee in both the House and the Senate. Yes, there is one appropriations committee in the House and one appropriations committee in the Senate. And then each of those appropriations committees will then have 12 subcommittees in both the House as well as the Senate. But yes, there's one parent appropriations committee in the House and one parent appropriations committee in the Senate. There's also one budget committee in the House and one budget committee in the Senate as well. We are at an interesting time now in the budgeting process, given this debt ceiling litigation legislation that's being considered by the House on the floor tomorrow. That could have profound implications upon how appropriations are done over the next year. A lot of those provisions that we see in that debt ceiling legislation are for 2014 and will then expire in 2024 and then expire in 2025. So therefore fiscal year 2024, and then all bets are off once we get to fiscal year 2025. It is interesting how a lot of these things are scheduled for going out of existence after the presidential election in November of 2024. I think there's agreement by both parties. They didn't want to have to mess with government shutdowns or anything at all like that, or debt ceiling increases or anything as they're going through that presidential election. And so it kind of, again, shows you how politics can have a profound implication on how we do budgets and our priorities in budgeting. So it's an interesting time for the federal level. It's also a very interesting time here in California. We are bumping up against June 1st, and the budget has to be completely done by June 15th, signed by the governor on June 30th for the new fiscal year on July 1st. So it's really coming down to crunch time to get all those details hammered out. And then after July 1st, then work on those trailer bills to actually govern how that money will be spent and how those programs will be implemented. So it's an important time both at the federal as well as the state level in terms of budget processes. So a good time to be taking this class, I guess, is the moral of the story. Okay, good points, good questions. Anything else before we call it evening? Okay, if not, I'll give you some time back. I know I kept you late last time, so I'll give you some time back for tonight. Next week, we'll get back together and do our budget formats. We'll do analysis and accounting and auditing if we have time. Again, remember, you have your first graded Canvas essay that is due by June 5th, and follow that link to priorities in the governor's budget and then how those priorities may have changed as a result of the May revise. All right. Thank you very much. I hope everyone has a good evening and a good remainder of your week, and I'll talk to you again then next Tuesday. So take care, everyone. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Professor, good night.
Take care. Good night.